Hi, welcome to News Editing. I want to talk today a little bit about, I'm going to make a few of these videos. This will allow me to free up some time in the class for you guys to do some work, but also to highlight some key ideas as we move along. For this week, one of the things we're going to be talking about is picking stories. And picking stories, that's something that's very important for anybody who is an editor, is they have to be able to decide if a story is newsworthy. And newsworthiness can be done on various levels. It can be done on the fact that there's timeliness, meaning it's something that happened recently. Something as simple as a festival, because it's being held in town this weekend, is going to be timely and maybe worthy of the paper. But, probably not going to be all that timely for you to run a story about, the state fair and all the acts that were at it last year, and how parking was an issue at it, or anything else about the state fair this week. I mean, this is not state fair season. The parking situation at the state fair would be timely at the time of the state fair, but not now. And so even though these may not be huge stories, timeliness makes a difference. There's things like, murder, and there's social issues, there's political issues. There's a lot of different variety, and the book talks about all those different things. Some of them are just, they're quirky. They're things that, you don't expect to be a big deal. I'll give you an example of one. I was watching the TV show How I Met Your Mother the other day, and Marshall, one of the characters on it is a guy named Marshall, and he had been mugged by a monkey, or somebody had mugged him, and he was kind of claiming he was mugged by a monkey at the zoo, and I don't think they ever really came to a conclusion about why, but he ends up saying that that's not really what happened, and this is going to become a problem because their friend Robin is a newscaster, and she has decided, she's pitched the idea of interviewing him for their morning TV show because it's a quirky story. A guy gets mugged by a monkey, and he's saying, well, that's not that unusual, and he's trying to downplay it because he doesn't want to admit that he's lied about it, and so he starts downplaying and saying, well, except in countries where, monkey theft is rampant, like India and Costa Rica, and he starts naming places where there are monkeys, and it is true that monkeys do in some of those places actually rob people, and monkeys can be trained to retrieve stuff. I don't think it's a rampant problem, but it possibly is, and so he started downplaying it in that, quirkiness is also somewhat in the eye of the beholder. That something you might find unusual wouldn't be unusual in Costa Rica, it may not be unusual elsewhere, but it's the fact that, that perhaps there, or perhaps because nothing is really talked about it a lot, it becomes a story worth writing because it's unusual. Now, the next thing after they decide, something is newsworthy, it's at least worthwhile in putting in the paper, they have to decide where it goes. Most newspapers have things, and I say newspapers, but we could talk about TV shows, we could talk about, we talk about radio programs, we could talk about, websites or blogs or other things. All of these have similar things, although they divide it up differently. But most newspapers, as an example, have a front page, and a front page tends to be the news of the day. It tends to not be sports, it tends to be news. It tends to, it needs some art, so it's going to need a photo package of some sort. But it tends to focus on, local or regional information, or really large national, international stories. Now, then they usually have pages inside that are devoted more towards wire, and are more devoted towards national or international news. They usually have an opinion page, they usually have a local page. They'll usually have sections throughout the week, like a faith section or religion section, a cooking section, maybe a health section. And so you can kind of move stories into those different categories. Something that is, something that's business related, that's a big deal, but it's not worthy of the front page, you're probably going to want to put that on the business page. And so, somewhat of it is just deciding where you end up doing what they call slotting. Traditionally, copy desks were sort of in what they used to call like a kidney shape. It's kind of a circular oblong table, and usually what happened was, you can think about sort of setting up tables sort of in a U maybe, I mean, I was working in newspapers after these desks had disappeared, so I can't really attest to all of it. But there was a guy who sat sort of at the middle of this U, and this was common. They didn't have computers. They didn't have anything else. They hand looked at everything, and they worked it out, and they would actually, work it out. But the guy in the middle was what they called the slot editor. And the slot editor decided what was going to move on, what was going to make it in the paper, and what wasn't. And so the slot would then say, okay, I think this needs to go, and I think it'll go on page 3, and I think it'll go about 10 inches in length. And then the slot editor would say, and we'll put it in this position. So the reason they call it the slot is they were kind of sitting there at the middle, I guess in the slot on the desk, but they were deciding what slots everything fell into. As the desk moved out, you would then hand the copy over to the person next to you, and each person would maybe do a different function. But what would happen would be is the first person out would then take the story and cut it down to size and write a headline, and then the next person would fine-tune edit it, like make sure every line was correct, and then finally there usually is, in at least the time my colleagues would tell me about, there would be a pneumatic tube, like you put your money in at the bank to go into the bank, that thing that goes, that they had pneumatic tubes, and you would actually put the paper you had, and it would go back to the press room, where somebody would physically take what you had taken and put little pieces of metal type into pages, and they would actually put together the entire story onto a press. Now, it's all done on computers. There isn't that setup, but that's sort of, it goes back to a printer basically that prints a plate, or now they actually just print directly to the plate, and the plates actually can even basically be programmed to go to their specific spots, and all the pressmen have to do press operators have to do is actually take the plate and put it on the press. It's really a fairly easy process in that regard. But at the same time, I say that, that's part of where the efficiency of a newspaper developed, is that when there were, you would take and put it through the pneumatic tube, somebody had to put all the metal in, and then later they used other methods. But there were a lot of people in the back working in it. So now you basically have you have a lot of technology, but you've eliminated a lot of workers. Instead of having hundreds of people working on a newspaper, 50 people or 30 people on a given night, you may have 3 or 4 in a paper like Springfield, or even a place like Chicago Tribune, or New York Times, or any of those. Now the other thing is the what I was going to say is that the guy in the middle was called the slot, and the people out the side were called the rim. They sat on the rim of the desk, and so they did what they called rimming the story. And if you rimmed a story, basically what you were doing was you were taking the story and you were editing it to length, writing a headline, and doing other things. But the slot was the guy who decided where the story goes, what slot it's going to fall in, maybe what art's going to be used, going to decide that this one's going to be 10 inches, it's going to go on page 3, it's going to go at the top of the page. And so everything has to be decided where it's going to go based upon its importance. Things on the front page are more important than things on the local page. Things on page 7 are probably not as important as things on page 3, although sometimes they're topical, and so it may just be that they're more important for that topic. A business story may be more important than a local story, but it doesn't matter which comes first. But it's put on business simply because of its connection to business. Once it's decided to go on a page, the editor still has to decide where on the page it's going to go. And the idea would be you want to put the stories that are most important at the top of the page. You want to put the story that's sort of second most important towards the middle. And you want to give enough space and other things. And every page is different, and so I can't tell you that there's any one set of rule. But the idea would be you kind of want to, you don't want to have a story about, 55 people killed in train accidents, in St. Louis, which would be fairly important story, I would think, anywhere in the United States, let alone here in Springfield, which isn't very far from there. But that if you decided, oh well, we'll just put that at the bottom of the page. Well, no, you need to put it there where people see it, because part of the thing is people flip the page, maybe they look at a story and then they go, they just kind of are flipping through real quick, and they may just look at the top pages. And so part of what you're doing is to find the most important, put them at the top, give them large headlines, make them very visible. The ones you want to run longer, you need to have a spot where that's going to work. You need to have some art on the page. And so all of that is part of what you're trying to work out. But you're trying to decide constantly what stories are most important, what stories we need to get in, and then you've got to kind of, you also have to be conscious that, even though there may be a lot of big breaking hard news, you probably want to work in some softer stories, some features, because some people are going to get overloaded with all that hard news and don't want it. And so, we are building a product, and we need to be conscious of our readers and realize that, we need to give them a little bit of everything. And so there's a little bit of an effort to try to break up a page and, give some quirky stories, give some fun stories, give some, stories that, that reaffirm our humanity, and all types of stories, and try to lay it out in a way that engages and encourages the reader.